And I hope in the future that Gavin and others will actually cite my defenses and respond to me directly.
We're only looking at the things in Matthew 16 that were on Jesus's mind. Any other aspects that need to be supported independently of Isaiah 22. Different aspects of Peter's office, including governing authority, teaching authority, supremacy, universality, infallibility, all of those things. I didn't try to cram all of those aspects into Isaiah 22 any more than I try to cram every aspect of Christian teaching on God into the contingency argument. I make an exegetical argument, not one based on my own typological speculations. So I would urge Gavin and others not to assume that Catholic apologists are committed to some freewheeling, uncontrolled typological argument from Isaiah 22, because they're not.
Even to say that, we need to look at what the rest of the New Testament says is a typological kind of principle, right? So we need to debate that and discuss these things.
This creates an issue in trying to use typological arguments to prove doctrines of the faith. I have to know the faith first in order to establish the proper bounds of a type. And if I then turn around and use my knowledge of the faith to prove a doctrine based on that type, my argument becomes circular. I'm assuming something, the particular doctrine I know about from the rule of faith, and then using that knowledge to prove it typologically.
You need doctrine in order to establish typology, and so typology cannot establish doctrine. My first response is simply to deny that you need doctrine in order to establish typology.
I'm assuming what needs to be proved. Circular arguments aren't really proof, not in the sense that will convince an unconvinced person. Circular arguments can show that two ideas cohere together, and thus they provide a kind of mutual support, and thus they can be used to illuminate or elucidate a doctrine of the faith, but they don't provide proof for the unconvinced. That's one of the reasons that scholars have historically said that typology is to be used to illustrate but not prove doctrines, because you already need to believe the doctrines or the argument may not work.
Typology only elucidates, it does not establish. The first response that I would have is this: there is not a neat distinction between elucidating versus establishing.
A related problem is the ambiguity of types. In a lot of cases, you can debate not only the ways in which a type and an antitype are similar and different, you can also debate whether one thing is a type of another in the first place. Maybe it's not a type of the thing you're claiming. And because of the ambiguity about where type and antitype are similar and different, you can potentially draw all kinds of inferences, but without the rule of faith controlling the situation, you can't know which inferences are solid and which aren't. I thus agree with St. Thomas Aquinas when he says that typology shouldn't be used to prove doctrines of the faith. So Aquinas says, and I agree, that when drawing a doctrinal proof from Scripture, you need to rely on the literal sense of the text, not the spiritual or allegorical sense, which includes typology.
People generally assume that during this time, typology and allegory were interchangeable.
Because otherwise the argument will depend on the rule of faith and be circular, or lacking the rule of faith, it will be uncontrolled and ambiguous.
Objections to typology not being able to establish doctrine. The first thing is that this is often asserted, but it needs to be defended. So we can't just merely have foot stomping here. We need an actual argument to be given.
However, we could ask the question of whether Jesus was thinking of the chief steward of the house of David as a type of Peter. I think the honest answer is maybe.
Let Scripture speak. Let's look at the text and respect how it is communicating to us. If the Lord saw a typological relationship between Peter and Eliakim, let's see what the Lord was saying there, rather than saying, you were saying something here, Jesus, but we don't really know what.
Similarly, the Isaiah 22 argument isn't meant to prove everything about the papacy. Even if Jesus was using Isaiah 22 in a typological sense, there are differences between a type and its antitype. And there are certainly differences between the office of the chief steward of the house of David and the office of Peter.
To assume that the New Testament limits Matthew 16:19 is simply that, an assumption that is open to debate.
For example, from what I've seen of Sonna's argument from Isaiah 22, he does not appear to be doing the kind of typological argument that Aquinas is warning against, which is uncontrolled and not backed up by the New Testament text. That kind of argument is unsuitable for establishing doctrine.